Please stand by. Good day and welcome to the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouses, the private safety net among low-income families with young children webinar. Today's call is being recorded, and at this time I'd like to turn the call over to Dr. Kristen Moore, SSRC Executive Committee Member and Senior Scholar at Child Trends. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Chris Moore, and I'm moderator of the Emerging Scholar Series. Welcome to today's webinar on the private safety net among low-income families with young children, presented by Natasha Pilkauskas with Christiane Lind serving as discussion. This is our 13th Emerging Scholar webinar. First, a very brief background on the SSRC. The Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse is a virtual portal of research and other resources related to self-sufficiency. It functions as an online community for researchers, for practitioners, and other stakeholders interested in self-sufficiency, employment, and family and child well-being. It's funded by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at HHS. The SSRC's purpose is to disseminate quality research, and we currently have over 4,800 items in our library and are constantly adding new resources. The library's materials are organized into the 12 topical areas that are listed at the right-hand side of this slide. Every item included in the library is reviewed for relevancy. Users may search by keyword or use filters like topic area, target population, geographic location, or research methodology to browse this collection. Every topic area under the Browse Topics tab includes our librarian recommends, a box that highlights research and resources recommended by the SSRC library team. Each topical area also includes relevant federal laws and regulations. The SSRC Emerging Scholars Program uses several selection criteria. We're looking for a graduate student or a degree recipient with no more than 10 years of experience who is currently doing research on a self-sufficiency issue that are related to those 12 SSRC topic areas. They should be conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue that warrants greater visibility. And we're looking for people who are working in an academic or a program, a think tank, or agency setting, and that can be at the local, state, or federal level. So please feel free to nominate potential emerging scholars for the future. As you can see from this slide, previous emerging scholars have focused on a broad range of topics: family structure, job loss, health insurance, early care and education, assets, the Great Recession, and paternal incarceration. Today's speakers are Natasha Pilkauskas, who's a PhD and is an assistant professor in the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And our discussant is Christiane Lind, program officer at the Northwest Area Foundation. We're appreciative of Christiane being the discussant. She's a member of the SSRC Technical Work Group. Please feel free to submit questions at any time through the question and answer feature, which is at the bottom right of your screen. And questions will be answered either after the presentation or after the presentation is given, or if we run out of time, via responses that are posted on the SSRC. And finally, we encourage you to join today's conversation on Twitter using the SSRC webinar hashtag, which is displayed on the screen. Tweets using this hashtag will display on the left side of the webinar platform. And now we will turn to Natasha.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. As you said, I will be talking today about the private safety net among low-income families with young children. So to begin, what I want to do is define what I mean by the private safety net. So when I'm using the term private safety net, what I'm doing is I'm referring to support that individuals receive from friends and family. And this we can think of in contrast to the public safety net, which typically encompasses things like government programs or transfers that people receive. Now, there are a number of different types of private safety nets, and people sometimes refer to the private safety net as private support or social support. But there's sort of three main types of private support. So there's emotional support, where you have someone to talk to. There's perceived support. So this is the belief about the ability to receive assistance when needed. So things like I can get a loan from someone if I need it, or I have someone to call if I need childcare. And then the last type of support is what we call instrumental support. Sometimes it's referred to as actualized support. So this is actual support that people receive. So these are things like financial transfers, living with other people, getting childcare from kin, or some sort of free transportation. And today I'm going to be focusing on this last type of support. Now, I should say that all of these different types of support have been linked with a variety of different outcomes. In particular, most of the research is really focused on perceived support, but both emotional support and perceived support have really generally been linked with positive outcomes for people. So, for example, perceived support is linked with mothers' better mental health. Instrumental support, on the other hand, has been linked with outcomes, but it's more of a mixed bag. So sometimes it's a positive thing, occasionally it's a negative thing, and so that's the area that we'll be focusing on today. And in particular, I'm going to talk about 3 different types of instrumental support. I'm going to talk about household extension, also known as doubling up, so living with others. I'm going to talk about child care received from kin. And then I'm also going to talk about private financial transfers, so getting money from friends and family. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about several published papers and a couple of papers that are still in progress that are all related to social support among families with young children. And today I'm going to talk about 4 main questions. So the first research question really is, what % of families with children do we see living in doubled-up households? How many are getting kin or child care from kin? And how many do we see who are receiving and giving private financial transfers? The second question is going to look at how much this private assistance is actually worth in terms of dollar values and compare that to the public safety net. And then the third question is really going to look at, well, I'm calling this the private safety net, but is it actually responsive in times of economic need? So does it actually serve as a safety net? And that I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that I wrote that looks at the Great Recession. And then lastly, the fourth question is, does private safety net participation come at a cost? So there's a lot of research that suggests that participation in private safety nets, there's a sort of reciprocal relationship that happens amongst families, that if you help someone now, if someone receives help now, they have to give help down the line. So this is sort of the idea of thinking about whether or not there's any cost to participating in the private safety net. Now you may be asking yourself, well, why should I care about the private safety net? And I would say, despite the fact that there are a lot of government safety net programs, we know that families, especially low-income families, still face significant challenges making ends meet. And one of the ways in which we believe, or certainly a lot of research suggests, that people make ends meet is through the private safety net. So in 2014, 21% of children in the U.S. were poor. And this, even if we use the supplemental poverty measure, which is a measure of poverty that also takes into account government transfers like food stamps or the EITC, we still see that 17% of kids are poor. So there's a lot of families that are still sort of struggling to kind of make ends meet. And we know also from prior research that private support has been linked with families, helping families make ends meet, and linked with a number of different outcomes. But, so as I mentioned before, some of these outcomes are positive, but it's not clear that that's always the case. So if we think about the case of living with others, doubling up, doubling up also leads to things like household crowding, which has been linked with poor outcomes for kids. And so it's not always clear that use of private support is a good thing. And certainly if we think about self-sufficiency, you can think about how the strength of the private safety net has implications for how families might do. So if we think of maybe a middle-class family, say someone loses their job, they experience a spell of poverty, they have this community of other middle-class families to draw on probably to try and sort of tie themselves through the bad times and to sort of get themselves back on their feet. In low-income communities where it's not so clear that that's the case, right? So you may sort of go through a bad time, you receive assistance from some of your other low-income families, or you may not, right? Because they may not be as able to provide you the same kind of support. But that even then later on down the line, the other low-income members of the community may also need your assistance. And so sort of how people are able to sort of escape poverty is less clear, and sort of depending in which setting we're talking about. And then if we want to think about policy, certainly, private support can be directly linked with your eligibility for government support. So, for example, doubling up, if you're living with a number of other people, this can actually affect your eligibility for certain services like food stamps. So there's sort of a direct link to policy. But I think that more generally, if we kind of care about low-income families and we care about low-income children, understanding how these families make ends meet is important for understanding and thinking about how policies might sort of address the needs of these families. So today, the vast majority of the studies that I'm going to be talking about draw on a data set called the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study. This is a longitudinal birth cohort study of about 5,000 children who were born between 1998 and 2000 in 20 large U.S. cities. And these, at the time, we actually oversampled non-marital births at a ratio of 3 non-marital births to 1 marital birth. So the resulting, what happened from this is that we have a very low-income sample. Mothers and fathers were interviewed at the time of the birth, and then again when the children were 1, 3, 5, and 9 years old. And during the 9-year data collection, when they were out in the field collecting the data, the Great Recession hit. And so I'm going to use this sort of information that we get about these families during the Great Recession and all of this data that we have about the families prior to the Great Recession to look at this in one of the research questions later on. So my first research question is really, let's look at see how many families do we see, families of children that are using the private safety net. And then first I'm going to talk about doubling up, and just to be a little more precise about what I mean by doubling up. So here I'm referring to having an additional adult in the household. So not the mother or her partner and her kids, but any other adults that might be living in the household with the mother and the children. Now this is a graph that plots the percent of children living in doubled-up households by the child's age. And you'll see that I've broken these out into different categories by marital status at the time of the birth. And I've done this because these are relatively good proxies for thinking about sort of economic disadvantage, right? So single mothers are much more likely to be poor than as compared to, say, married mothers. And what we can see here, the yellow line at the top, is single mothers are also far more likely to be living in a doubled-up household, and that this declines over time, and the decline is sort of, that occurs across all families. But even in year 9, single mothers are still far more likely to be living in a doubled-up household as compared to, say, married mothers. And if we were to take this information and kind of average it, about 22% of children are living in a doubled-up household, or at least urban children are living in a doubled-up household. But there's another way to think about this. So while about on average, if you sort of think of in a snapshot in time, about 22% of kids are in a doubled-up household, and this is very comparable to nationally representative estimates, you could also look at how often do we ever observe a child in a doubled-up household, sort of thing, so kind of thinking about exposure over time. And in this case, if we do that and we look over time, what we find is that actually 1 in 2 children has lived in a doubled-up household between birth and age 9. So that's a lot of children. And then a lot of my work is actually focused on grandparents. And so this is grandparents, what we call multi-generational households where a grandparent, parent, and a child live together. And when we look at just those kinds of households, we find that about 43% of children have lived in a multi-generational household between birth and age 9. So what this suggests is that a lot of the doubling up is happening with grandparents, but it's also happening with grandparents and other people. And then lastly, because I've also used another data set called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Birth Cohort, which is a nationally representative sample, here the data is collected between birth and age 5, and if we look at the number of multi-generational households there, we find that about 1 in 4 children has lived in a multi-generational household in that 5-year period. And that's a lot of children, and this is a nationally representative sample. So I don't think that public policy has really thought sufficiently about what this means for children in terms of, we tend to define the family as kind of the nuclear family or the mother and her child, but clearly there are a lot of other people who are entering the lives of these children. And second, so in terms of child care, and here I'm talking about child care received from friends and family. Now, about 43% of the children in the fragile families are in child care between ages 1 and 5, and this is pretty similar to national estimates that Census puts out. And what we find is about 25% or 26% are being cared for by grandparents, another 14% are being cared for by other kin, and then about 60% are in a daycare, some sort of formal private daycare arrangement. And this, again, is very similar to estimates that we see, sort of nationally representative estimates. But what's interesting here is if you look at the differences by relationship status, we don't really see very large differences. And this, despite the fact that single mothers would probably be the most economically needy, or those who would be most in need of having sort of free or reduced price care from kin, because in general, child care that comes from kin is less expensive, although frequently still paid, than other daycare settings. And lastly, if we look at private financial transfers, so this is getting money from friends and family or giving money to friends and family. What we find here is if you look at the blue bar, this is the 21% of families in the fragile families gave a private financial transfer in the last 12 months. 19% received a transfer, and then 15% both gave a transfer and received a transfer. Now what's interesting here is that the differences by relationship status show that the single mothers were the ones who are the most likely to have engaged in both giving a financial transfer and receiving a private financial transfer. So this kind of harkens back to the idea of thinking about, sort of low-income communities and people who are sort of in the idea of reciprocity, so needing to both give and get sort of private social support, as compared to married mothers who are probably the most economically able to do so. And so these are, and if we want to look at where these people are getting money from, what we find is, so among the 36% of families that received cash transfers, the vast majority are getting money from grandparents. So the grandparents of the child are their own parents. However, a significant share are also receiving money from other kin, so about 41%, and then a small percentage are receiving money from non-kin. Okay, so I think hopefully I've convinced you that there's a lot of sort of social support that's going on amongst families with children, but how much is this private assistance worth, and how does it compare to the public safety net? So first I'm going to describe to you how I'm kind of estimating the worth of the private safety net. So the estimated rental savings from doubling up comes from a paper that I wrote with Sarah McClanahan and Irv Garfinkel. And what we did here was we tried to estimate that the rent that mothers were saving by living in a doubled-up household. And we compared mothers who lived in a doubled-up household to those who did not live in a doubled-up household. We took, essentially, what we do is we use an equation where we predict the rent that they would have paid were they not living in a doubled-up household, compare it to the rent that they did pay, and use that difference as the savings that people are getting from doubling up. And we do a number of different things in the paper to sort of test the sensitivity of this finding, but and if I'm happy to share that later. Both. And then in terms of private financial transfers, here I'm just actually looking at the dollar amounts that people report receiving from friends and family. It's pretty straightforward. And then lastly, in terms of the estimated savings from using kin for child care, here what we did is we took, in the fragile families, they actually collected additional information from child care providers. And what they did there is they interviewed both kin child care providers as well as other private child care providers and asked a lot of information about costs. And based on that, what we did is we estimated an average savings from using kin for child care as compared to using other forms of child care. That average savings was about $1.66 an hour. And so we go back to the survey and we can see the number of hours that mothers report using kin for child care. And so we can then take that and make sort of an annual estimate of the savings to child care using kin to child care. Okay, so what do we find? So the first line here is showing the annual rental savings from doubling up. And we find that it's worth about $4,000 a year. Private financial transfers, the mean was about $2,900 a year is what people were receiving, although there's a lot of variation in that. And then lastly, in terms of the estimated value of child care from kin, here we find that mothers are saving about $2,800 a year by using kin for child care as opposed to private child care. But how does that compare with the public safety net? So here what I'm doing is I'm showing you the value that people are getting in the first line from cash transfers. So this includes temporary assistance from needy families, supplemental security income, and unemployment insurance. And about 27% of these families are receiving one of these three forms of government cash transfers. And on average, the amount that they receive is about $3,700 a year. This is very similar in magnitude to the doubling up estimate, for example, and the percent of families who are receiving both either doubling up is about 22% and cash transfers are about 27%. So relatively similar. Now, if we look at food stamps, about 40% of the sample is receiving SNAP, And the average cash value for that is about $3,000 a year. That is very comparable to what we see people in terms of receiving private financial transfers. If we look at public housing subsidies, the way I've calculated this estimate here is we've taken fair market value rent and sort of looked and compared what mothers report paying in rent, and that difference is this $7,500 figure. Now, public housing is very hard to get, although 20% of this sample is getting public housing. And this is because it's a relatively economically disadvantaged sample. So obviously here, public housing is worth a lot more than any of these other programs. And then lastly, if we look at the EITC, we see that the average value of the EITC is about $2,400. But what's important here to note is that nearly 60% of the sample is eligible for receiving the EITC, right? So a lot of people are getting this subsidy. So, you know, I should say, you know, there's a lot of other, in terms of the economic value from the private safety net, there's a lot more that could be considered sort of a cost or a benefit of the private safety net. These are things that are just focused on one sort of narrow aspect of it. But if you kind of look in magnitude, they're relatively comparable in terms of the value of the private safety net to the public safety net. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's sort of a lot of use of the private safety net and that it seems to be relatively economically valuable. But does the private safety net respond in times of economic need? So does it work like a safety net? So I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote with Aaron Gottlieb and Irv Garfinkel here, where we looked at whether or not during the Great Recession, whether private financial transfers increased to families with young children. So we were interested, so the outcome measure here was looking at whether or not anyone received a private financial transfer in the last year, so a binary variable. And then we were looking to measure the Great Recession. We used the unemployment rate over the last 12 months in the cities in which the mothers lived. And then we're going to use the year 1 through 9 data of the Fragile Families Study. And to show you sort of what we're sort of taking advantage of here in terms of the unemployment rate, sort of an exogenous shock to these families, is this is a figure that plots the unemployment rate over this time period in the 20 sample cities. And what you can see is there's a lot of change over time. There's sort of an uptick in the early 2000s, that's the dot-com recession, and then again a really large upswing at the end of the graph, which represents the Great Recession. So there's a lot of variation across time, a lot of variation across cities, and even a lot of variation within cities and time. So I'm not going to go into the details of sort of the methodological approach that we took. Essentially, we run a number of analyses and we control for a lot of things. What I'm showing you here is the predicted probability of receiving a private financial transfer when in good economic times. So that's around when 5% unemployment is what we're using. That's a pretty average unemployment rate. And then in bad economic times, so when the unemployment rate is about 10% or the peak of the Great Recession. And so what we predict is that about 30% of families would receive a private financial transfer sort of good economic times, but that it increases to about 39% in bad economic times. So that's a 9 percentage point increase or a 30% increase in the probability that someone would receive a private financial transfer. Now, we also looked at this for among the poor and the near poor, so people who are 100 to 200% of poverty. And here we saw an even larger increase in terms of the receipt of private financial transfers. So this is, you know, suggestive of the idea that yes, at least in terms of private financial transfers, there does appear to be some sort of response, so that the private safety net is responsive when people need, you know, have a greater need for these transfers. And I should also mention that in other researchers have found that doubling up was also responsive during the Great Recession, sort of again lending credibility to the idea that the private safety net is responsive. And then lastly, now if we, there's been a lot of qualitative research that has looked at low-income communities, suggesting that, you know, people really do make ends meet by relying on social support, but that it can come at a cost, that frequently people are expected to give in return. And so we were interested in looking at this as well. And so I'm going to discuss what I'm calling the other side of the private safety net, which is this idea that, you know, if I help you now, you have to help me later, this kind of idea of these norms of reciprocity that might be possibly to one's own detriment. So again, here we're going to look at private financial transfers. This is a paper that I'm actually writing with Colin Campbell and Chris Weimer. And here what we're saying is we wanted to see whether or not giving a private financial transfer was associated with experiencing material hardship. So material hardship is a consumption-based indicator of economic well-being. In these data, we're using 10 different items of hardship that are measuring things like difficulty paying bills, experiencing some form of food hardship, so like not having enough food to eat, having your utilities cut off, an unmet medical need, or some other housing hardship like being evicted or living in your car. So we're going to take this and we're going to construct a binary variable that's an indicator of experiencing any hardship. Again, we're going to use the year 1 through year 9 Fragile Families data. And here I'm going to run some individual fixed effects models for those of you who are interested in the methods. And what I'm showing you again here are the predicted probability of experiencing a hardship based on whether or not you gave a private financial transfer in the blue bar or whether you did not give a private financial transfer in the red bar. And here what we find again is a significant association that giving a private financial transfer is associated with a higher probability of experiencing material hardship. And so the difference is about 4 percentage points. But we were also interested in looking at whether or not there were differences by where you sort of are in the income spectrum. So here on the right-hand side, you can see the same associations for people who are in the bottom third of the income distribution, and the association or the difference is even larger for that group in particular. And so this is suggestive, and you may note that there's really high levels of material hardship, right? Remember, this is a low-income sample, and so a lot of people do experience hardships, and a lot of people who aren't poor also experience material hardship. But in some, I kind of think that this is certainly suggestive of the idea that people are actually giving private financial transfers even when it's detrimental to their own economic well-being, which is sort of suggestive of the idea that people are sort of embedded in these networks where they feel like they have to give, or they have other friends and family who are in dire need that they then need to also assist. So in sum, I think that the role of the private safety nets is really complicated, right? So it can help families become self-sufficient. In many ways, I'm sure this is true, but it might also prevent families from achieving self-sufficiency. So, the private safety net likely does help many families manage day-to-day struggles. Certainly, my research suggests that it has some real economic value and that it's responsive in times of need, but it may come at a cost, at least in terms of material hardship. So although the private support may be valuable, I certainly don't want to suggest in any way that I think that the private safety net would be a good substitute for the public safety net. And in fact, many families tap into both to try and make ends meet. And so if you are interested and you want to read more about my work, these are the different papers that I actually drew on today. The first 4 are published and the last 2 are still in progress. But if you're still interested, feel free to email me and I'm happy to share. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Christiane, our discussant.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you for the opportunity to provide some quick reflections. So I believe that research is the most meaningful when it focuses on important questions that can help expand our understanding of self-sufficiency issues and can help advance practice and policy in the field. And from my perspective, Natasha's research really hits on both these marks. So quickly, just in terms of expanding understanding, I really appreciate how this helps us reframe our understanding of low-income families. So historically, public safety net programs have been designed around low-income individuals or families with dependent children. And anecdotally, we've always had this sense that many people support family members or friends outside of their immediate households. What I think this research does is really brings to light and help expand our understanding of the financial lives of low-income populations, how they use both the public and private safety net to make ends meet and to cope with some of those financial shocks. And the second way I think it helps expand our thinking is we typically look at low-income people from largely, I would argue, a deficits perspective, so thinking about the resources that they don't have. They're low income, they don't have enough income to make ends meet, and this really shifts our thinking a little bit more to an assets perspective. So it really highlights kind of the resiliency of these families, the relationships and support networks that they have, not only to give them emotional support, but really instrumental and real material support to help them get by. So In this way, I think it gives all of us a deeper understanding of the dynamics in the lives of low-income people and communities, and how public policies are only a piece of the larger puzzle for supporting greater self-sufficiency. And then the second piece about how it helps advance practice and policy in the field, I think it has some really interesting implications. So some of the things that I was thinking about for policymakers, it might encourage you to think about what ways private transfers push us to think beyond just income in designing social safety net programs. How can we better understand kind of the role of savings as well as debt? And is there an opportunity to explore how and in what ways various public safety net programs discourage low-income families from pooling resources? And does it really need to be kind of, are we trying to encourage a trade-off where it's either a public support or a private support? Are there ways to think creatively about how both the public and the private programs can work better together in combination to really support these families? For practitioners, I think it's an opportunity to really reflect on Natasha's findings and to assess to what extent the findings resonate with your experiences working with clients on the ground. How might this broader perspective of public and private transfers change how you think about assessing and responding to clients' needs? Would you ask different kinds of questions, and would you change the way in which you try to manage cases? And then for other researchers, on the call, I think it might raise a whole host of other questions that might be worthwhile investigating. So some of the questions that came to my mind were on the question of prevalence. I'm curious whether the patterns of receiving or giving private assistance vary across different racial or ethnic groups. So some of those subcategories of characteristics of individuals. In terms of the comparative value, Natasha spoke to how private assistance compares to public assistance, but I would wonder, there's other forms of private assistance, so how does it also compare to things like credit and debt from former financial institutions, and to what extent are low-income families also drawing on those sources of private support to make ends meet? And in terms of responsiveness, Natasha spoke about how private support generally tends to be responsive during economic downturns like the Great Recession. I'm also curious about whether it responds to other types of volatility in the lives of low-income families, so things like accidents or illnesses or just those day-to-day kind of hiccups in their expenses or incomes. And then finally, in terms of cost, I think it's interesting to look at the cost to the individual, but again, extending beyond that, like what is the cost to the family, the broader social network, or the community at large, and really thinking about how strong is the private safety net, and is it sustainable when you look at that, when you take that broader perspective. So on the subject of other research, one question I'd like to ask you, Natasha, is about what else you're working on. Can you give us a quick overview of what other dimensions of the private safety net you're hoping to explore in the near future?
Sure. Well, so you've touched on one of the things that I'm actually working on now, which is actually to look a little bit at the overlap between the public use and the private, using the public safety net, using the private safety net, and kind of who's not accessing either, who's falling through the gaps, and trying to get a better understanding of those dynamics in particular. I have some other work that's also looking up more specifically at sort of the outcomes in terms of thinking about, okay, like a paper that's looking at doubling up and material hardship, as well as another paper that's looking at sort of the dynamics between household extension and what that means for for poverty. But in terms of other types of particular safety net, I haven't actually been doing any work on any other ones besides these three. These are the three primary ones that people tend to access, but they're also the only ones we tend to actually really get a lot of information about in surveys. So unfortunately, sort of from the quantitative side of things, it's hard to get a lot of information about a lot of the other ones.
Well, great. It's great to hear kind of both the research that you've been working on as well as what's teed up for the near future. I'm sure that everyone else on the call has their own reflections and questions that they want to ask, so I'll keep my remarks brief and turn it back to Chris Moore to engage all of you in the discussion.
Thank you, and thanks both of you. We have several questions that have come in. One asks about private safety nets, noting that they are not viable for many families, as is the public net. How do we bridge the gap?
Oh, boy. That's a hard question. I think you're right. I think people, private safety nets are certain. I mean, that's partly why I want to do a little bit more research on it, trying to understand who doesn't have a private safety net to rely upon. And, I think there's certainly from the qualitative literature, there are suggestions that people kind of exhaust their private safety nets, like after a certain amount of time, people don't want people in their house anymore. How do we bridge the gap between the public and the private safety net is that's the what is it, $1 million question, right? We want to figure out how to help how to help these families, and I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
Here's a related question, actually. Could Natasha comment on the stress on an aging population in low-income communities? Grandparents provide much of the instrumental support on a fixed income while also facing illness and spousal caretaking duties. I don't know if you had information on that, if you've looked at that.
I have thought about this. So I do look a lot at grandparents. I have to say, typically grandparents in the low-income communities are actually pretty young. So in the fragile families, at the time of the birth, the average age of the grandparents is about 47. So they aren't really the same grandparents, I think, as we think about a lot in terms of, the sort of aging population. I mean, certainly there has been a lot of research that's shown that it is more stressful for grandparents who have to take care of kids, especially if they're taking care of them themselves, right? And that can be very difficult. But there's also been research that has shown that for these grandparents who are involved heavily in the lives of their grandchildren, that they find it very satisfying and rewarding to care for these children. So, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I also think that there's also a lot of stress on the middle generation, so the sandwich generation, which is not exactly what the question was asking about, but there's also kind of a lot of dynamics that's sort of very complicated. It's both positive and negative in many ways.
And who are you thinking of as the sandwich generation? The parents of the children?
Oh, yeah, sorry, the parents of the children who may be caring for an aging so their own parents, the grandparents, right, living in the household, they can be taking care of them as well if they are in poor health, or if they're in sort of, some sort of financial situation that's not so great, which can have, have effects on kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another question is, what are effective ways to get data on private safety net use? Are there some ways that are more accurate or effective than others?
Well, we need to ask. I mean, I think that there's a lot of great census data sets, for example, that collect information on a variety of different topics. And some are better than others in terms of asking questions about, like the SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, does a really great job of collecting information on child care and use of child care, kin for child care, for example. But we don't necessarily ask about other types of questions, and very rarely do we really ask people, why they're living with others. In fact, off the top of my head, I can't think of any quantitative study that does that. But I do think there's plenty of opportunities if we were to add some questions to some of the existing surveys.
A related question is, can you recommend any data sources for examining the private safety net in rural areas?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I don't know if you could get that from, you might be able to, I mean, it depends on what aspect of the private safety net you wanted to look at, right? So some of these census data sets, certainly you can ascertain whether people are doubling up, and as they're meant to be nationally representative, I'm sure you would be able to look at rural areas as well. But I don't know about transfers. The panel study of income dynamics does a really good job of getting information on financial transfers as well. I'm not that familiar with that study, so that might be another source.
A comment has come in about data. Data are generally unreliable because they're subjective and qualitative. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I love data. No, sure, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're unreliable. I mean, I say that there is error, right? So people don't remember well. So if we're looking at things like the dollar value that they're receiving in terms of private financial transfers, I would agree that it's probably inaccurate. However, I think everybody is sort of likely to make the same kind of error, right? And so on average, I think we're kind of getting, some people are going to overestimate, some people are going to underestimate. So on average, we're still getting information that I think is valuable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A couple of questions about older children. To what extent do you find that adolescents provide kin care?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I actually have no idea. I've never looked at that.
There, next year.
Yeah, there you go.
The question is, would the private safety net look different for older children?
Yes. I do think. I mean, clearly we're not talking about accessing child care, and we know doubling up becomes less common as children age, although it's still relatively common. And private financial transfers also tend to decrease in terms of the receipts from families as children age. So yeah, it would probably be a little bit smaller. That's a good point than what I've shown you today.
So a question about nonprofit charities. What is the role of a nonprofit charity in providing support? How would you categorize it? What is the role?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great question. Certainly nonprofits, I didn't talk about them at all today, do play an important role for many people in terms of making ends meet. I personally don't know anything about that area. It's really not part of my expertise, but it's certainly an important part of sort of the overall picture for families.
So a follow-up question. The Fragile Families Study and other data sets are linked on the SSRC website under use data sets and data sources. So if people are thinking of looking at these data or the panel study of income dynamics or SIP, I'm expanding, it is on the SSRC website. Question about child care. And whether there are trade-offs in terms of quality and stability with having it provided by kin.
Yeah, so there's a relatively large literature that looks at the quality of child care, and this is not my area of expertise in particular, but certainly there are debates about whether or not, well, I'm going to say this, that the research finds that high-quality center-based care is best for child outcomes, right? So, and then other variants from there, may or may not be as good. But certainly, I think that for low-income families, a lot of people are working non-standard hours, and child care and other forms of child care may or may not be available. And so, there may be a quality trade-off, but there may also not really be another choice for some of these families. And there may be a preference, frankly, it's great if you're great. I'm sure a lot of people would feel more comfortable leaving their children with their own parents than with other people. So it's complicated.
Okay, and Christiane, I want to encourage you to jump in the conversation if you want to. Have another question here about, were there any other examples of the private safety net that you considered that weren't covered in the webinar, including social emotional support? Have you looked at that?
I personally, I haven't really looked at it very closely. The Fragile Families does collect a lot of information on perceived social support. So do you have someone you can sort of lean on when you need to? And there's a number of great studies that have looked at those that generally find good things. So if you have, the more social support you have in terms of the perceived aspect, the better it is for you in all sorts of outcomes. But I myself have not actually really used that data.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And by the way, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A answer feature at the bottom side of the screen. That you just mentioned was another question. Do the same families tend to get more than one type of resource?
Yes, so that's interesting. That's something I have looked at a little bit. It's most typical to just get one of the three social supports. A small, I can't remember off the top of my head, but a small percentage do receive 2, and very, very few families receive all 3 sorts of forms of support.
Uh-huh. So research has found that low-income communities sometimes create a system of bartering for services. Would you say your research supports this finding?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, certainly qualitative research has definitely found that this is the case. I unfortunately, I think that sort of the last research question I talked about suggests that there's some sort of at least reciprocal something that's going on amongst low-income communities, but I can't really get at what people might be getting, what people might be bartering in particular. But yeah, it's certainly been suggested that that's the case in other studies.
Mm-hmm. So a question about that bartering or reciprocation. Why is reciprocation a bad thing? What are the trade-offs?
That's a good question. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but I think the idea that, Carol Stack has this great book that she wrote a long time ago, and then Eden and Lane have also since then have suggested that sort of in the qualitative research that a lot of times mothers feel that they have to, do things for other people even though they can't, it's not really what they would want to be doing right now if they had the choice, right? So in a sense that and certainly in my work, we think about kind of you're giving a transfer, but you're experiencing a financial hardship. If you're capable of providing, so when we went to this research question, at first we definitely didn't think that it would necessarily be a negative thing. We thought people will only provide transfers if they can, and so there shouldn't be any association with hardship. But that doesn't appear to be the case, and so I do think that being situated in this sort of reciprocal relationship shouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but it may be if people are kind of having to do things that aren't so great for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. What about the community safety net? For example, food pantries, drop-in centers, free clothing, shared meals.
Yes. What about it? They exist, and certainly there's a lot of evidence that families take advantage of those, right? I don't have any of that information really in the Fragile Families data, so I don't know a great deal about it, but certainly I think that other people have found that to be the case.
Yeah, having it all in one database would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Do people tend to rely on the private safety net due to personal preferences or because of failures in the public safety net?
That's a great question. So this is a little bit what we want to try and get at with this new study that we're looking at, is trying to see, in particular, if there are people who are not eligible for the public safety net, so let's say a recent immigrant family, or people who are just sort of just above the cutoff for eligibility in terms of thinking about whether or not you can receive public assistance, to see whether or not we sort of see any variation around that in those groups in terms of who is accessing the private safety net and who isn't. It's a complicated matter. It's hard to know if people are choosing. Sometimes you may choose the public safety net. Certainly, qualitative evidence has suggested that people feel, shame or stigma, for example, for accessing TANF, and they may have a preference to rely on their private safety nets. But a lot of private safety nets can't, it's hard for them to provide a lot of support. So, that's it. I think it's all tangled together. It's kind of hard to say.
Mm-hmm. Getting good questions here. What are key research gaps on the private safety net? They're the things you're going to study, right?
Yeah. So, I think we don't know a great deal of. Well, there's some data gaps for sure. In terms of, we don't know why people use safety nets. We don't know, for example, we have to kind of infer about things. So a lot of people who live together, we only get information, let's say, on rent from the household head. So we don't know if other people within the household are paying you rent. We don't really know what the arrangements are within these households. I think that there's this, it's very hard to study because you can't really tell the direction of causality, but sort of thinking about a number of economists have sort of studied the idea of if you have a private safety net, does that mean you don't rely on the public safety net, or vice versa? Is the public safety net use, does that decrease private safety net use? And so we're thinking about those interactions is important, but it's really hard to do well. And I think that's probably a big gap.
Yeah, as you noted, some of the forms of public and private safety net are not mutually exclusive. You could get EITC, for example, and other things, public or private. Do you find that that's common, that people cross those barriers, that categories?
Yeah, so in the fragile families, I've been looking at that at least among low-income populations, so people who would be eligible for public transfers. And among that group, we find that about 55%, I think, of the families so 55% of the low-income families are using both a public safety net, at least one public safety net, and at least one private safety net. So there's certainly overlap. I mean, it starts getting complicated because there's all sorts of things you could be tapping into, but more or less, yeah, there's definitely overlap.
Interesting. Here's a question about higher income families. Do we know about anyone who has looked into how low-income families use private safety net versus how middle or upper income families use their private social networks or their safety nets?
Yeah, I can't think of any research that looks at that question explicitly. I mean, in most of my studies, we do look at differences by income group. So I only presented the low-income families today because those are the people sort of who are most interested in thinking about. Married families, for example, which I was sort of using here as a proxy for higher income groups, but also higher income groups still receive a lot of private financial transfers, for example. They receive them slightly less frequently, but they receive much larger amounts when they receive them. And I think, for instance, when we look at differences by child care, higher income groups are still also receiving a lot. So there's a lot of private support that is happening at the higher income levels. I don't really know a lot about sort of thinking about kind of reasons for tapping into it or differences like that.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose if you included college, it would really,
Yes, right. So there's a lot of, they're returning home.
So a comment. New perspectives and broader framework of solution finding and insightful, informed intervention strategies. I'm better informed. And in educational settings, it is more strengths-based approach. So I believe that is a commendation to you for the work you've done. And we have gotten a lot of questions, and you've answered them efficiently and effectively, so we are through them at this point. So unless you'd like to make a closing remark, I would just like to say thank you to both you, Natasha, and to Christiane for participating in this webinar on the social safety net among low-income families with young children.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.